Okay, here we are at the last new chord symbol video in my series. I want to wrap it up. The my system 2000 chord notation is nothing more than a new perspective. It's just a new way of looking at the chord. It's the same chords that they've always been. It's just a different way of looking at them. And I'd like to think my system is not a coalescence of leftover crap like the contemporary system is. It's not a potpourri, a hodgepodge. It borrows from traditional theory, but then it departs from traditional theory, and ultimately I think I have here an independent system. And it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect, but I haven't found anything better. I went on Google, Amazon, YouTube, all those places, and I couldn't find anything better yet. Okay, and as I mentioned, why did I even bother? Well, in the 20th century, only two serious works on chord notation were done. One, I showed you, Karl Brandt's standardized chord symbol notation, published in 1976. And the only other one was mine, which I wrote in the mid-90s, but I didn't publish it until 2008 because I kind of got lazy. But I finally published it, and I showed you all that. And not only that, but by 1984, there was still no consensus on chord symbol notation. Even after Karl Brandt's work, there was still no consensus. People did things their own way, one way, then the other, and blah, blah, blah. So there was no consensus, right? Now, so my videos weren't designed just to show you the chord. They weren't just designed to show you the chord and say, hey, do you like it or do you not like it? I wanted to show you the process I went through over decades, the process I went through to develop my system. So that was another feature that I wanted to make sure that I covered. Now, one of the goals was throughout the process to be as accurate as possible. And the reason being is because a chord is a structure that should give an estimation of vertical quality and mood. In other words, the chord should have a certain, let's say, call it a sonic flavor. And then the chord should suggest complementary tones. And you see this in the realm of jazz music. A jazz artist, a professional, hears a chord and immediately knows which scale tones or which melodic tones will go with that chord and make a beautiful sound. And jazz artists make such beautiful music. So that's what a chord should do. Now, when you want to impart that chord data to somebody else, that data has to be precise. So I wanted to try to be as precise as possible. So I had to do a lot of research. I worked at the time when I was starting this, or wrapping it up, I should say, I worked at the Albuquerque library system, and I went through all their books, big library in a big city, and I even went to Seattle, Washington, to what they call their center library, the Seattle Public Library, and in their system they have over 930,000 books. And when I walked in and saw the music section, it was just row after row of books. It was unbelievable. What a beautiful thing to see. So I looked at every pertinent work and to make sure I was covered. A lot of research. And then my other goal, which I mentioned, was to simplify, but not simplify to the point that the system was degraded and chopped up and ruined. So I made a point to simplify, make it as easy as possible, as sensible as possible, and then also to standardize. But standardization is not going to happen unless I throw the system out and show it to people, and either they reject it or they embrace it. If they embrace it, at some point over time, standardization could possibly happen, but I'm not holding my breath. Also, I wanted to acknowledge, which I made clear in my videos, that over time, over a period of 1,200 years, two unique paths of discovery were going on at the same time. One was humans using intuition and common sense and figuring out the tones that they like to hear and writing lines of music that they like to hear. I talked about this in previous videos. And at the same time in nature, in physics and acoustics, in the realm of nature, the harmonic series had already mapped out a system. And it's beautiful. In the harmonic series, as I mentioned, the low spacings, the perfect intervals, provide the spacings that you need for orchestration when you're writing in the lower registers. Nature shows you how to space out your music so it doesn't sound muddy and crunchy and all crappy. It makes for clarity. So the lower registers of the harmonic series show how to write your lines of orchestration for the lower registers. In the middle section here of the series, it gives you the intervals you need for chords. It's beautifully designed, naturally. And then in the upper section, it gives you the seconds that you need for scale formation, at least in Western music, like your minor second interval, major second, and augmented second, because all your Western scales are made of those intervals of seconds. So that's a beautiful thing. The harmonic series, which I just love. I'm not qualified to talk about it, but I'm trying to just give you the basics, all right? And then in my system, we don't call sharps and flats accidentals anymore. We call them specifiers. Very simple, specifiers. That's important. And specifiers are used only for note or tone names. Like here's a G4, which I already mentioned. Don't want to labor on it. Then you have a G flat 4, but that's not a modified G. That is an entirely separate entity. And that specifier goes with this note head, to let you know that's an entirely different note. And here's a G sharp 4, and I went over all that. You can review if you want to. Then you have, in my system, you have, I did mention, and I keep repeating this, specifiers, used to be called accidentals, are used only with tone or note names, and those are letters, like G sharp 4. Now, then you have your modifiers in my system, which I mentioned, I showed you. It can be numbers or symbols. All right? And the modifiers are used to modify a chord, not the note. Specifiers work on the notes. Modifiers are used for the chord itself. And I already went over that. All right? And I talked about intervals. Intervals are not sharped or flatted like you hear in the messy contemporary system. Here's an example of a perfect fifth. And even though you see here the C sharp, the interval is called an augmented fifth. And here you see a flat symbol. It's a specifier. But the interval itself is a diminished 5. And I won't go on and on because I already showed you all that. But I'm showing you the key features. All right. Now we have in my system the graphic symbol, called graphic or just symbolic, that's this, which I showed you. And you have the linear alphanumeric if you want to write it out on a piece of paper, type it out with your keyboard. C major 7, point, diminished 5, point, augmented 9. And then if you have a chord in which the bass tone is not the root tone, you put a forward slash, and then your letter, which represents a note or a tone name. I went over that. Made that pretty clear. All right, and that's a point. It's not a dot. There's no such thing as Google.com. I don't know why they talk like that. Okay, then you have the basis of the system. You figure out your bass chords first. You determine them. Then you worry about modifications. I showed you the bass chords. You can review that if you're interested. I showed you the fifth bass chords. I don't call them triads. It's kind of silly. It's obvious it's a triad. Then I have my seventh bass chords. I showed you that. And then ninth bass chords I showed you. And then the 11th bass chords. And then there are 13ths, which I don't need to show. It's redundant. All right, we talked all about that. There are the 5 sizes, which I just showed you. And then for the fifth chords, all right, you don't need to put the size indicator because it's a given. It's understood. You don't need to put that 5 in there. That's silly. But here you put the 7, 9, 11, and 13 for your other bass chords. You do write it in there. So you make it perfectly clear. The type indicators, augmented, major, minor, dominant, and diminished. And the sizes can vary when you write them, but if you set it up like I did, graphically, it makes it perfectly clear because of the position of the type and size indicator. It makes it perfectly clear. So there's your type indicators once again. And then you have your graphic symbol, linear alphanumeric. You can make any chord with this, and the person reading the chord, interpreting the chord, should not have any trouble. It should be virtually impossible to misinterpret the properties of the chord if you use my system. Virtually impossible. You'd have to really purposely try to screw it up to get it wrong. And in my system, all right, the notes are not superimposed, all right, which means placed on top of. They are superposed, which means placed above. One note placed above another, superposed, all right? But you can have notes that are interposed. Here you have your 2/3, and placed in between those 2/3, interposed in there, placed between, is this note. Same way over here, same thing. We have interposing is fine, stick a note in there. All right, you have that. And then there's a lot of things that we don't have, and this is very important in my system. We just don't have. I have augmented 7 bass chords, but I don't use the actual augmented 7 interval, which I mentioned. The interval of the third, the note at the third is not modified. That third's very important, very profound. As far as creating the mood or flavor of the chord. So the third in my system is not modified. It can be removed, but don't modify it, right? And I don't use these horrible terms, semitone, whole tone. I talked about that. I just don't use it. That's kind of idiotic. I don't use that. And there's a lot of things I don't use. Don't use the third. The note at the interval of a third is not modified. The augmented 7 note I don't use. That's redundant. All right. I don't use parentheses. I don't use, like, here's in parentheses flat 5. I don't use flat or sharp tones, just like here. Flat 5, flat 9, sharp 5. I don't use that terminology. That's crappy. I don't use the delta sign for a major 7. Don't use the abbreviation, major, minor, dominant. Don't use the V for dominant or X for dominant. I don't use it. Once again, I mentioned the flat 5, flat this, flat that, sharp this, sharp that. I don't do it. Don't use the abbreviation for diminished. I don't use the minus sign, like -5, -9, meaning flat 5 or flat 9. It's actually a minor 5, minor 9. So these are the things I don't use, and I went over all that. So, if you have any questions or want to work on a chord or you have trouble with it, just send a note down there in the comment section, and I'll try to get back to you. But I want to move on to other things and get back to making my accordion videos, because people actually watch the accordion videos for some reason. I'm not an accordion player. Some days I can't play to save my life. but they watch them. They watch a video. So I'll get back to the accordion, and I would like to get into my next system. Now you probably don't care. And that would be, I'm going to skip my scale system. I'm going to skip that because that's very lengthy, but I'm going to I'll probably jump to System 2000 staff notation. Many years ago, I invented a new way to look at, write notes on a staff. And you might like it, you might not. Okay, that's it. I apologize for taking so long, and that's it. I hope you learned something. Thank you, and good night.